you're there first. How can this make sense? A 3-point lead in the morning for Labour, and then a 6-point lead in the evening for the Conservatives.
Well, this is just the nature of polling, Adam. The way it works is it's very difficult to get 1,000 people who represent the UK, and 1 in 20 times we get it wrong. And it looks like today's ICM poll is that 1 in 20. It's very hard to see how the Tories are really on 39%. It seems more likely that they're on around 34 or 33%. And this all comes down to two things. One, ICM are a phone pollster, and phone pollsters have started to give the Tories better scores than other pollsters. And two, it's just sampling error. This is what happens. Once in a while, you get a poll that's above the trend.
There have been others showing the Tories ahead, though.
There have been others, but they haven't been showing them anywhere near 39%. The highest before this was 36. And the reason we can say today's was odd was because it showed the Tories doing best among wage-dependent workers in the north, in Scotland. These are things we know aren't true in general, so it seems odd.
And Joe, and these were all before Labour's manifesto launched. Just how useful do parties find the polls?
Well, of course, they will tell everyone that they don't pay any attention to the polls, but clearly that's not the case, because we'll often find that policies and the presentation of policies are tweaked in reaction to polls, and as we know, a lot of policies are kind of pre-tested by internal party polls. So polls are important, definitely, but I think that we've seen for such a long time that in the run-up to this election, that the two main parties have been fairly evenly matched in terms of their results, that actually, in a sense, I wonder whether one could argue that the parties almost ought to ignore the polls now and sort of, you know, do something a little bit more passionate, because all the steps that we've seen to date have been quite timid, quite tactical, and there's a lack of vision.
Shown by not much movement in the polls. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, because we did have the Labour leader today saying, I'm ready. His big message, Matthew Taylor, was that he is ready to take on the country. And is he a man who's looking at the opinion polls and beginning to think, well, yeah, I might actually need to be Prime Minister in 3 weeks' time?
I think we say that you shouldn't take much notice of polls, but you do, and they have an effect on morale. I remember when I worked at Millbank, we did a graph we stuck on the wall for the late lamented Philip Gould, who was Labour's pollster, which had a correlation of Labour's lead and Philip's faith in polls, and we showed that when Labour's lead went down, so did Philip's faith in polls go down, because he was so optimistic. So it does have an effect on morale, and I think actually it's unfortunate that ICM have come up with this poll, which is almost certainly, as Harry says, a rogue poll, on a day when Labour has got momentum. There's no question about that. It won. There's been 3 weeks to this campaign. I'd say Labour won the first week, the Conservatives won the second week, and Labour pretty clearly won the third week. We're going into the fourth week, and Labour started off strongly. This manifesto launch was the best possible time for Labour. They've been improving in the polls. Ed Miliband's performance has been improving in the polls. He was confident today. And I actually don't agree with Jan in the sense of I think up to now the parties haven't taken many risks. But Ed Miliband leading on this sort of fiscal rectitude point today. I mean, if you read the manifesto, it's mentioned 3 times in the first 17 pages, 6 of which are photographs. So they're really hammering this point home.
17 out of 85 pages.
Is that a risk? I'm not sure that's a risk. I think that's driven by necessity. He had to correct.
But they're stepping out of their safety zone. It's a bit like if the Conservatives were to lead tomorrow with the NHS. You're going somewhere.
They have been leading with the NHS over the last few days. I mean, there is a peculiar kind of swapping of political clothes.
I mean, are they hitting the right targets, do you think? Did this Labour manifesto hit the targets that, on the basis of the polling, Labour needs to hit?
Well, I agree. I mean, if you look at Labour's polling, there are really 2 weaknesses, as Matthew says, rather. One is the economy, in which they trail. Voters are about twice as likely to say they trust the Tories to manage the economy than Labour. Older voters are even more likely to say so, and they're the most likely to vote. And secondly, they trail when it comes to leadership. And Miliband trails David Cameron, despite a recent uptick. Now, no party has ever won an election which has trailed on both of these 2 issues. The reason why Labour might is because new issues are becoming important. If you actually ask voters what they really care about, what they want is they want a party that represents people like them and stands for ordinary people. And Labour beat the Tories on both those 2 fronts.
Joe, it's quite interesting what you were saying earlier about tweaking things when it comes to polls. How much tweaking do you think will be going on tonight ahead of the Conservative manifesto launch tomorrow?
Well, there may be some tweaking in terms of presentation, in terms of the things that they want to bring to the fore the most. But
in response
I think
to
at
what
this
Labour
point,
showed today.
no, I think that's doubtful. I mean, the only thing that did occur to me is on the minimum wage promise, which seems to be the one.
There's this rumour going around that a text has been intercepted which suggests that there is going to be a Tory proposal to take the people on the minimum wage out of tax altogether?
I mean, something like that wouldn't surprise me at all, because coming out of the manifesto launch today, I felt that was one of the few kind of positive promises that Ed Miliband was making. And I mean, he mustn't underestimate how clever George Osborne is as a strategist, as a tactician, and I could well see them bringing something to the fore tomorrow to neutralise any effect that might have.
It's all pretty mystifying for the voters, isn't it? That what we've seen in the last few days is the Conservatives, whose campaign up to that point was all about fiscal rectitude, saying that they're going to put $8 billion into the households, but they don't know where it's going to come from. They're going to cut inheritance tax. And then Labour, that's been majoring on helping ordinary people, and the NHS saying, no, it's all going to be about taking a tight rein on public spending. And I wonder what the electorate make of this. And I suspect that, and I'm interested what Harry's view is on this, I suspect that most voters, the voters that matter, the undecided ones, are not going to make their decision until the last few days.
Well, also, they're not paying attention. I mean, we talk endlessly about the impact of all these things, but almost nothing changes the polls. I mean, the only real thing that changes the polls are big events, things like Cleggmania in 2010, the SNP surge after the Scottish referendum. You know, the ups and downs of politics, the nom-dom affair, the European arrest warrant, even manifesto launches, these things don't really filter through.
The difference is, you know, look at our poll of polls, 1 point in it. Some polls actually have the parties on the same level. I mean, this kind of nuance is going to matter, be significant, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. When the gap is so small, then every movement matters, of course.
And there's one thing that could happen still, and that is if either party were to establish a consistent 3 or 4 point lead, it enables them to play a trump card, and that trump card is we are the only party that can form a stable government. You either get a stable government with us or some kind of hideous coalition with the other side.
Well, that's what the Tories have been saying.
The Tories have been hoping that they could get to that point and they'd say Conservative stability versus a mess. It's possible, though, of course, if Labour were to take a consistent 3 or 4 point lead, they could make the same argument. And I think when we get to the last few days, people will start to get more nervous about the possibility of a constitutional crisis if this election comes up with a result where it's almost impossible to form a government.
Are you surprised that it's as close as it is for the Conservatives? Because we were hearing, well, when people start thinking about this, the Conservatives are going to pull ahead, people are going to cling to Nurse.
I'm slightly disappointed. Am I surprised? I think all the leadership the leadership of the two main parties has been quite timid and restricted, I think, by the closeness and the narrowness of the polls for several months now.
But in a sense, if you are the governing party, you have the Prime Minister, perhaps you could afford to be bolder.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I think David Cameron's got a very good story to tell, and I think that he can afford to be bolder, and he should have been bolder. I think, for instance, I would like to have seen him debate David Miliband in a one-on-one debate. I know we're past with all of those.
We'd all like to see him debate David Miliband. That would be fantastic TV, but Ed probably would take primacy.
Indeed, well, that's a Freudian slip, perhaps.
To share the criticism equally, I mean, you talk about being bold. Labour once led in the polls by 10 points for almost a year in 2011, 2012, and yet we had very little from the Labour Party at the time. We're literally 99% of the way through this Parliament, or since the last election, and now we're suddenly having big moves being made by the Labour Party. It's quite late in the day for this.
Yeah. I mean, you've been there, you've been an advisor during the election. How much difference does a manifesto make? How much difference does an election campaign make, in your view?
I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference if you know if there's a strong leader, it's incredibly rare for the campaign to change anything. But as you said, when it's as close as this, it is more important. And I think that there are a couple of issues here. This issue of Ed Miliband's leadership is interesting. It does look as though he has made some dents in that kind of sense that he was almost a joke to many people. I don't think many people felt that people might not agree with him anymore, but he has raised his stature. So there are 2 or 3 things that could change. And as I say, if one party got momentum and it could argue it was the only party that could form a government, that could make a difference.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.